Hello and welcome to the Hindu's Parley podcast. I'm your host, Samreen Wani. Last week, a panel discussion in Delhi on inequality, economic growth and inclusion, which was attended by renowned French economist Thomas Piketty, India's chief economic advisor Anantha Nageswaran, and Dr. Shamika Ravi, member of the Economic Advisory Council to the Prime Minister, reinvigorated a debate about ways to address widening inequality in India. Piketty, of course, through his bestsellers, has often spoken about a billionaire tax to address persistent inequality. In the Indian context, however, his work has highlighted the fact that not only is India one of the most unequal countries in the world, but also that under this new billionaire Raj, inequality is at historical highs, and in some sense, perhaps worse than it was under the British Raj. And a wealth tax on the super rich in India, essentially which would affect just about 0.04% of the population and would leave the rest completely untouched, well, that could be a solution. And he proposes using these collections for necessary social sector investments afterward. Other members on the panel, they were quite skeptical of the idea working in a developing country like India, especially since it could have effects on retaining capital within the country. Now, India has in the past already experimented with a wealth tax. It was abolished in 2016 and 2017, partly because the government felt that the cost of collection of this tax was really high. We have Mr. Ajay Shah, Senior Research Fellow and co-founder Xkdr Forum, and Rahul Menon, Associate Professor at the Jindal School of Government and Public Policy, to discuss if wealth tax should be brought back to address inequality in India. I welcome you both to Parley. So, Mr. Shah, is it a good idea to reintroduce a wealth tax in India again?
I'm not an enthusiast about taxation of wealth. And this goes to the issues of sound design in tax policy and in tax administration. Okay, and these questions are not unique to India. This is economics. This is the universal language of economics. So the idea runs like this, that we should never think about public policy from a standpoint of moral outrage. We should think about means and ends and the effectiveness by which certain objectives can be met. So for right now, even if I'm willing to believe that inequality is a major issue that requires focus, the problem is that wealth taxation leads to many unintended consequences. Okay, so there are two kinds of difficulties. Problem one, that how are you going to measure the wealth of a person? Okay, so if the government says that I will demand the measurement of the value of the assets of a person that are held in liquid assets like equities or debt or bank accounts, then people will get a strong bias in favor of holding illiquid assets like real estate and gold. Okay, so how is the administration going to work? How are you going to objectively define what is wealth? And in fact, it is very harmful for the country when people emphasize holdings of real estate and gold, because the productive assets of the economy are the equities and the bonds and all the raw material that goes into building the corporations. Okay, so it should always be emphasized that the GDP of a country is the output of all the firms of the country, and all modern economic growth happens inside the large complex firms of the country. So to do the process of modern economic growth, we need to create conditions for the emergence of large, complex, sophisticated firms that impound large amounts of capital and create complex management systems. I mean, if we're not going to do that, then there is no growth. So a wealth tax would create a systematic bias for people to not hold wealth in a transparent way that is visible to the authorities. And the second and simpler scheme is people would just leave. Okay, the elite of every country matters disproportionately. All the truth, all the beauty, all the wealth of a country is created by its elite. Modern populism is very harmful. And if we say that we will have high taxation of the elite, then many in the elite will just leave. And all the prospect of progress of a country gets damaged. So from these 2 points of view, I'm not excited about a wealth tax.
All right, Mr. Shah. Professor Menon, Mr. Shah is clearly not an enthusiast. What would you say? Is it a good idea to reintroduce a wealth tax in India all over again?
So a lot of what Dr. Shah says cannot be argued against. Wealth taxes have had a history in India, and it has not been a very successful history. And there are several problems with it, as he has obviously mentioned. The fact that you can have capital flight, the fact that you can have diversification into different assets. However, I do believe that it is time to start talking about it. And let me preface my comments by saying that all my discussions about the wealth tax obviously assume lot more than just the wealth tax. There needs to be a solid ecosystem around it. I mean, just implementing a wealth tax, just announcing a wealth tax in a budget is not going to do anything. There needs to be a large ecosystem, large institutional framework around it, which we will discuss as we go ahead. But I do think that there is a case for it right now, simply because the levels of concentration of wealth are extremely high. And I do not think that it is a moral problem to call out the inequality right now. I do think it is a very fundamental development problem, because an increase in inequality does reduce capabilities and opportunities for a lot of people. And that goes beyond just a moral question. So I think there is a strong policy imperative to take care of inequality today. Now, we'll discuss most of the problems as has been brought up in this brief comment here about capital flight, etc., all of those. But I would like to just make one statement here, that I think the world today looks very different from the world of when the wealth tax was introduced, because we do have a very sophisticated and strong system right now to track economic activity. We have just implemented it for people at the bottom half of the pyramid. So we have an Aadhaar system. We have linked it with PAN. We think that the costs of implementing Aadhaar to access basic entitlements, basic wages for Narega, we think those costs are okay, even though it leads to certain problems like some people being denied wages, right? So we have undertaken this massive and this very impressive public policy exercise to link people's financial data across the board, right? If I'm an income taxpayer, my PAN is linked with my Aadhaar. There is a record of all my financial transactions. If I'm a manual laborer, my biometrics have been taken in order for me to access my wages. And I think given that we have built this state capacity at the bottom, I don't see a problem why we can't start thinking about using it at the top. And that, I think, is a difference from what it was before. We have ways to track wealth right now. So I don't think that the world is the same as what it was before. I think we do have many changes that would make it easier for the state to do it if it wanted to do it. That's a fundamental problem. I completely agree. But I think the world has changed, and these changes in technology have come about. We have thought it as an economy, as a society, we thought it's okay to do this exercise of tracking financial flows for those who are not at the very top. So I think we can do it for those at the top. And now other questions which we will get to, like how do we do it? All of those are very valid questions, but I think it is time for discussing those questions. And I do not think we should stop and say that simply because it is difficult, we must give up the whole exercise. If we did that, we wouldn't be doing what we do right now with taxes and with Narega. We didn't stop at the very understanding of how large this process would be. We persevered, and rightly or wrongly, there's a huge debate on that, right? But the point is, we did that for those at the bottom half of the pyramid. I think it's time to, at the very least, start talking about doing it for those at the top, because I think it's a smaller population, it's a smaller subsystem. We could do it if the state wanted to do it. And I think it's important to start talking about a wealth tax, at least to put it out there on the table as a very strong policy option for the economy today.
Got it, Professor Menon. But, we had a wealth tax before it was abolished in 2016-17. But the collections from that were less than 1% of the gross tax collections. And like I mentioned, the government had also said that the cost of collection of the wealth tax was really high. And that's why we sort of discontinued it. But what were the issues? What specific issues, apart from these, what specific issues did we have last time that we had a wealth tax?
I mean, much of the problem was what afflicts most economies when we undertake something like that is, again, as Dr. Shah said, how do you define this wealth? Not just how do you define this wealth, how do you define who is the owner of this wealth, right? It is very easy to shift my wealth from one form of holding to another. It is very easy to change ownership of who holds this wealth from one person to another, right? I mean, I have a lot of wealth. I can just say that this does not belong to me, this belongs to someone else, and I exercise effective control while in name alone it is with someone else, and that enables me to evade my tax. Now, these problems don't are not removed. These problems will continue to persist, and these problems were what plagued the tax infrastructure before. This is also something that has affected the developed world. Collections from wealth taxes are very, very low. As a proportion of most tax revenue, it is very low. But I think there are ways to counter that, just as what I had mentioned right now, that Aadhaar, we have used this infrastructure to look specifically at people, at taxpayers, income taxpayers, at manual laborers under NREGA. It's time to start thinking about, can this be utilized to paper over some of the problems that were there before? And in the literature right now, in much of the literature that's been motivated by Piketty's claims and Piketty's ideas to bring back a wealth tax, there are a lot of other interesting propositions that have come about to say, plug all these loopholes, do a comprehensive tax, don't distinguish between labor and capital, tax real estate at the same rate as you tax, say, equity assets, right? Again, these are conversations that are coming about, and my only point would be that it's time to start opening ourselves up to these conversations and debating it, because the levels of concentration of inequality that we have right now are very different from what was there before, and also inhibits a lot of capabilities of people, and should therefore be taken as a very serious public policy problem.
Sure, Professor Menon. Mr. Shah, you've got something to add to the problems that Professor Menon spoken about with the previous wealth tax.
I want to say two things. One is, I know this is not the main subject of this podcast conversation, but I wish to just put up my hand and say that I'm not convinced that inequality is an important problem for India. Okay, growth is the only problem that we should focus on in India. Would you rather be poor in India, or would you rather be poor in South Korea or the UK or any of the advanced economies? And the answer is, of course, you'd rather be poor in South Korea. So we should never get our eyes off the ball. There is one main story that is worth playing for, which is the story of growth. And we should not get distracted to go off into side stories, particularly when the pursuit of those side stories can be harmful to growth itself. So I am not here to agree that inequality is a problem and we're only discussing the means. But then let's discuss the means. Rahul, we are here debating it, so it's great. Okay, so you said we should be discussing this stuff. Here we are, we're debating.
Right.
I'm not able to solve the questions of valuation. So you are right that a sufficiently draconian police state will be able to force one single identity number on every natural person, and you will be able to pin down the person who owns X. Okay, so it would be a dystopian horror. Okay, I would not want to live in such a country, but yeah, sure, I could envision that you could do that. But you will get stuck on questions of valuation. So let's go through the pieces. Step one, I am the owner of land and the income tax department knows that I own this land. How does the income tax department arrive at a normative value of that land? Okay, not even in the cities of India are we able to solve the normative valuation in circle rates. There are circle rates in India that are higher than the market value. There are circle rates in India that are lower than the market value. So you're stuck. Okay, step two, I am the owner of a company and the company is the owner of the land. Okay, now how are the authorities going to tie all these pieces together? And I do not believe that any government anywhere in the world will be able to see through multiple chains of ownership. And once again, it is a fundamental human right it's a right of association for me to make a company, and that company is located in the Cayman Islands, and then that company owns land in India. Okay, this is all just fundamental human rights. No government should interfere in all that. And then what kind of dystopian surveillance system are you going to build? Okay, and I'm only on one asset, that is land. Number two, let's look at companies. Okay, a very large amount of wealth is contained in unlisted companies. How are you going to value unlisted companies? How is an income tax officer going to value an unlisted company? I really don't know. I don't know the way. I cannot imagine what's an objective measurable mechanism. There is no Marxian theory of value. There is only a market theory of value. So a company is worth whatever a buyer is willing to pay for it. And there is no way, there's no written down procedure through which a income tax officer can do something predictable in terms of the valuation of a company. And third, think of physical assets like gold. Okay, are you going to have income tax officers come into my house and open my cupboards? That's another dystopian nightmare. And problem number four, when you build that dystopia, the elite will leave. The most important people that you want to hang on to have a great society, are precisely the people who will leave. So populism has a problem that it doesn't work. When you rise in this emotional dislike of the elites, and you actually bring either mob violence or state violence to bear against the elites, it creates unlivable countries, and that's not a path to progress. So we've really got to tamp down this rhetoric and get back to a more Gandhian approach of, look, we are all here, let's live together and let's make a good country. And that's about building prosperity rather than getting into warfare about distribution.
Right. Professor Menon, do you have a response to Mr. Shah's comments there?
Yeah, certainly. Thank you, Dr. Shah, for that. There are obviously a lot to discuss here, because the question of distribution always is political economy in its purest sense, right? Like, it deals with very technical questions of economics, and it also deals with questions of policies and politics and how we have to organize a society. Now, I do agree that that an economy that requires a high wealth tax does require a strong sense of enforcement. I would disagree with the characterization of it as a dystopia. I would disagree with the characterization of taxation as class warfare or leading into mob violence. I think that the questions that are being discussed here and the questions raised by Piketty fall very far away from these poles. So, I mean, we require enforcement, and we require a lot of ways to find out what these values are. But I think calling that automatically a dystopia is not quite accurate, because Piketty's wealth tax and would be on the very, very rich. Say, like, he says only for the 0.04%. We don't need to deal with the universe of unlisted companies. We are dealing with people who have, say, a lot of listed wealth, right? These are publicly listed companies. We can get an idea from the market of what there is. I'm not denying that there aren't problems with this. I completely understand, because if I put a tax on wealth and the equity shares, and if the equity shares value fall down on the announcement of the tax because investors are spooked, the person's wealth completely changes, and then the base of my calculations completely change. I get that there are problems there, but I don't think that it requires income tax officers coming to my house to open it, because I am not going to put this tax on the majority of people. I am not going to put these tax on people who hold gold at home. I am not going to put these tax on unlisted companies. The idea is to put it on, say, a very small subset of people who have most of their wealth can be seen from the market itself, if they're holding most of their wealth in equities. Now, secondly, and of course, there are going to be problems, and the problems of capital flight and the problems of them leaving are extremely difficult. I would slightly counter the idea that the elite 0.04% are the only ones we want in the country. I think that every citizen who's producing and is working is contributing to wealth and contributing to growth of the economy. I think it's bad that any Indian is left out of the economic race. But I would say that, yes, a wealth tax, the way Piketty is talking about it, cannot be done without international cooperation. Now, that's a big stumbling block that we have to understand, that it has to be global, because if someone who is rich is moving away from the economy, even if they do not move, there are some studies that say that the rate of billionaires leaving a country when there's a taxation are not that high in Norway and France. It could be very different from India. People in India might just leave. These are open questions. Even if they don't move, the wealth will move. They will put all their money, say, in Dubai real estate. A wealth tax needs to be global. And now we could classify it as a fool's errand and say this is never going to happen. Or we could start by saying this is something we desperately need in a world of spiraling inequality. And I do think inequality is a very real policy problem. We can have a debate on that later. In a world of climate change where we need resources to tackle this, the debate between poverty and inequality we could get to a little later. During all of this, it's important to at least push this idea. And I think that is what Piketty's call for a wealth tax is doing. He's pushing this idea in the mainstream. I think it's time to take it seriously, given the myriad range of policy problems that we are facing right now.
Right. Piketty's work, essentially, it was based on income tax data from India, consumption, wealth, national accounts data, rich lists data. Now that might have certain issues, but that's certainly not a problem which is specific just to India. So my question, Mr. Shah, if you could go first, was how can we address this problem of data so that we can arrive at better approximations of inequality?
At the upper end of the distribution, there is no hope of meaningful data. So, for example, I have worked with household survey data, the CMIE household survey data. And, realistically, if a field investigator shows up at the household of a rich person, first of all, you and I are never going to be at home. So the field investigator is never going to get our data. And people are not going to realistically report on their income. So household survey data really does not capture the upper end of the distribution. And I don't know any other way to improve the data. So no, I do not see a useful pathway to creating these data sets at the upper end. Like there is the Forbes magazine ranking of the richest people in the world, but that's not a description of a country. That's other than that, I don't know any good data to measure how things work at the upper end.
Right. Professor Menon, any suggestions from your end? How can we address this problem with data that we have so that we can arrive at better calculations for inequality?
Yeah, Professor Shah is completely right. The surveys don't give you a true picture of what's happening at the top end. There are ways, and most of the work that's being done by Thomas Piketty and his collaborators and others like Rishabh Kumar and Ishan Anand have also written a paper where they're using these wealth lists is to use economic techniques of interpolation, combine these Forbes list and the Hurun lists, all of these different lists, combine it with surveys to try and get some amount of data over a period. Now, it's very clear that these are not perfect. These are not perfect pictures. This is an approximation. Does it stand? That's what we need to go back into the data. That's what we need to look at the papers. And there is a way to bring these two together, the survey data and these Hurun Rich lists, these Forbes lists that give you a picture. It's not the perfect picture, it's a picture. One of the most important ways, however, to do it is international collaboration, right? If every country is revealing how much wealth is being held, say, in Dubai real estate, in Switzerland banks. The US has tried doing that right now. They're signing these agreements with other economies and with these other countries to develop more transparency. So this goes back to a point that I made earlier, that this wealth tax that Piketty is calling for needs to be thought of at a global level. And again, to reiterate what I just said, you might very well classify that as a fool's errand. But my personal preference is to say that it's something we do need to push for. And to my mind, it's a very important solution to the scale of problems that we are facing today. Global cooperation on a problem should not be thought of as immediately impossible. It is extremely difficult to manage, no doubt. It is something to push for. It is definitely something that we need to do. And this wealth tax lives and dies on the basis of the extent of international cooperation that we can get. Can that be done? It's extremely difficult. Should that be done? We do need to start talking about it.
So I want to come into this. So I'm very nervous about global cooperation because there is sort of a first world view that people in the West like to think that they will impose a scheme. Okay, so Marxism was supposed to be invented in the UK and imposed on all the various countries of the world. Piketty is like the phase 2 of that same approach of resentment and hostility towards the elite that is sought to be rolled out everywhere. But when these global systems are done, they play out in very different settings. So how the communist paradise worked out in Maoist China was very different from how the communist paradise worked out in the USSR. Okay, so think of the implementation of a wealth tax. And as I said, the heart and soul lies in how you think about valuation questions, about the police coming into your house, surveilling you, looking at your information. Imagine what a dystopia it would be for civil liberties in India if these kind of powers are given to the income tax officers. If I was in the UK, I might argue about it differently because there is rule of law in the UK. There are civil liberties in the UK. If I was a British economist, I don't know what arguments I would be making, but I would be thinking from scratch for my setting. But I'm an Indian economist and I'm very conscious of the frailties of Indian democracy and civil liberties in India. So do you really want to give powers to the income tax officer to deeply surveil the lives of people? And no, Rahul, I'm not happy when you say it's not going to happen to you and me. It's only going to happen to the 0.4%. There are people too. Nobody should have to face that dystopia. even if you are rich, you should not have to suffer a terrible life where the income tax officers are inside your personal records and coming into your house and inspecting your documents and inspecting your cupboard and so on. So I feel, we should be gentle and mild and care about fundamental civil liberties and human rights for everybody. And of course, if we don't, in the nature of the Indian state, what this will lead to is elite flight. And yes, everybody does useful things, but really, you want Vishwanathan Anand to stay. You want Gukesh to stay. Don't create conditions where the elite will leave. Human accomplishment, whether it is poetry or chess or business or literature or science, is deeply, deeply unequal. A tiny fraction of the academic researchers get all the sites. So if you just go after the elites, you will create a country of low human accomplishment. So, imagine if you were standing in 1947 and you said that everybody in India should have roughly the same educational attainment. We'd have basically turned into sub-Saharan Africa. It is only the extreme inequality of human capital which has given the great Rahul Menon, who is a academic at Jindal Global University today. Okay, you and I, we are creatures of Indian intellectual inequality, and we are the only hope that is there for this country. So we should be very cautious about this populism and inequality game that is popular in the modern world. It is deeply harmful. It has always been deeply harmful. It's better to learn to live with each other. Okay, I am pissed off that Vishwanathan Anand plays better chess than me, but my mother would tell me, don't envy other people, improve your game.
Right, Mr. Shah. Professor Menon, I would like to ask this question to you first, considering how Mr. Shah had already spoken about this, earlier. So even during that panel discussion, there were two main contentions against the concept of a wealth tax. One was, of course, the idea that wealthy individuals and capital will leave the country in case if a wealth tax is imposed. And the second was, of course, the idea of the tyranny of concessions or the law of unintended consequences. The fact that if you do impose certain thresholds, then certain people will or certain organizations will always try to be below that. And this in turn will just widen the gap between the bottom half and the top half. Your take on that? What are your comments on that?
Okay. Well, first, there's a lot to unpack here. So if we could, come back to some of these questions that have been raised a little later. Let me address these first on capital flight. Yes, capital flight might happen. As I had mentioned before, there are some papers out there that says that the scale of capital flight is not too large in countries like the UK and in Norway. In Norway, they increased, I think, tax that on the rich, and then it led to some amount of flight, but very little. Not too many people moved away. Now, it might be very different here because in countries like Norway, there is a lot to keep people there. There is a lot of public infrastructure is great, health and education is great. So there is a reason to stay there, even if your taxes rise by, say, half of 1%. In India is not the case. There might just be a lot of flight. Even if people themselves physically are not leaving, they are taking their wealth outside, which is why I reiterate the problem of we need global cooperation for this to work, right? Now, here's the second thing. And again, this might very well, I think this goes again to the heart of certain differences between Professor Shah and me, is that the wealth tax by itself means nothing unless it is used properly. So there are several ways of what we do it. One thing that Piketty has spoken about recently is that we invest in health and education with this wealth tax to make a more productive workforce. Now, again, I'm talking in, say, of course, these very in like this. I mean, the only way to use it is I'm using the end path of a model that exists in my head, but we economists love to create fairy tales. So the idea is that if we can use this wealth tax and invest in health and education to create a more educated workforce, to create a more healthy workforce, we give a reason for people to continually invest in here, even if wealth is raised. Again, this is an optimistic situation, but it gives us a roadmap, which is that I do not think that it would automatically lead to a fall in productivity. One other idea is that you can tax a lot of wealth and you create some sort of universal basic income. Universal basic incomes can boost entrepreneurship and productivity. If I don't have to, rely on a day job, I can think about my startup. I can do some more productive forms of self-employment, right? I mean, I do think talent is normally distributed. I don't think it's, and again, it's not about bringing everyone down to the same level. It's about moderating a certain amount of inequality. All these discussions we are having about wealth taxes, no one is saying that everyone should be made equal. We can still have space for a Vishwanathan Anand. We can still have space for a Gukesh. The point is, can I take this money from some of the very rich, give it to certain people to give them greater capabilities in life so they can study chess and become the next Gukesh? Is the next Gukesh somewhere in interior Jharkhand finding it very hard to make it to school because the family can't afford 2 meals a day or 3 meals a day? Let's try and institute a system of health and education, raise the resources from a wealth tax to do that. The question of thresholds, again, thresholds for MSMEs don't matter if I'm taxing 0.04%, right? So that's the thing, that if these wealth taxes are placed at the very top end of the distribution, MSMEs, there's nothing to keep MSMEs low, right? They can grow up until they reach 0.04%, and then that's when I'll tax them, because the 0.04%, at least in Piketty's scheme and in a scheme with which I agree in, that much amount of wealth should not be concentrated there. And the last question, just briefly about inequality. Again, I'm not talking about a police state. There are problems with how do we limit taxation authorities. I think it's a very real discussion that has to be had alongside this. But if we think that every move to reduce inequality is going to be a problem by reducing civil liberties, we also have to place against that the fact that increasing billionaire wealth reduces democratic participation. And that's clearly seen today in the shape of Elon Musk, right? His involvement with the Republican Party, he is saying now that the AfD in Germany is the only natural party that has to rule in Germany. He's gone and had photo ops with Nigel Farage. This is a man who's engaging in politics with certain parties that are clearly on the right, anti-immigrant, which has been called out for their very divisive rhetoric. So again, no one is talking about bringing about perfect equality. We are talking some amount of inequality will always be there. How much is too much? That's a question we need to address. And Piketty's ideas is that these levels of wealth that have been cornered by certain people for India, where the top 0.04% hold about 25% of wealth, however defined, that's too much. And this level of inequality, far from giving us the next Vishwanathan Anand and the next Gukesh, also gives us Elon Musk. And that is a problem when he is intervening. I'm not going to say interfering, but even if he's intervening in elections and the democratic process, is deeply problematic.
Mr. Shah, your comments on the fact that that it can be deeply problematic, this concentration of wealth at one end of the spectrum could be also intervene with our democracy at some point. Your comments on that?
The emergence of democracy in the UK, starting from the Magna Carta in 1215, happened with generation after generation of enormous concentration of wealth and power, way, way, way beyond anything that we see today. So I don't see an inconsistency between the concentration of wealth. Inequality is a fact of life. We have to create better coping mechanisms whereby we don't come to blows. And I have a great discomfort with the populist impulse of taking on the inequality directly. Generation after generation. So let me take an example of India of 1947. At that time, the left obsession was land reform because they believed that land was property. And now when we look back, we realize it is so silly because actually it was the business of building the companies. It is the Infosys and the TCS which created the wealth. And they were willing to undergo great levels of social strife for expropriating the rich of their land of that age. So, I'm not impressed and excited about the project of fighting the inequality frontally. Inequality is a fact of life. We are highly unequal in everything. Some people are prettier than me. Some people play chess better than me. And I should not whine about that. Okay, I want to come back to the question of these thresholds that we have seen many, many research papers in India that because the labor law kicks in at 10 people, then the firms organize themselves to not grow above 10. And so, that is a very much a concern. Similarly, if you will only tax the wealth in listed companies, then people have a powerful incentive to stay in unlisted companies. Okay, and again, that's a very big cost. It's a distortion for the country because actually publicly traded listed companies are a very healthy part of the overall capitalism. So these are examples where there is a direct connection between trying to raise a wealth tax and damaging the growth project of the country. Finally, I want to come to this idea that we should do a wealth tax because it can be used for X. This is wrong. This is wrong. This is wrong. It is a fundamental feature of public finance. And I am disappointed that a skilled economist like Piketty does not get this. It is a fundamental feature of public finance that you have a complete decoupling between the expenditure question and the revenues question. When it comes to expenditure, we ask ourselves, what are good uses of public money? And basically, they're public goods. Okay, so get the air quality of North India solved so that Jindal Global University has better health amongst their faculty members and their students. That's a public good. Improve the law and order all over India. That's a public good. So there is a very clear agenda of what is to be done, and some democratically legitimate government should choose what they want to do by way of spending money. Separately, completely separately, we should ask the question, what are the efficient ways to raise taxes? And there you've got to ask the question that given our limitations of administrative capacity and the weaknesses of the political system, the lack of rule of law, what are the least harmful ways in which taxation can be done in India? And I happen to think there are only two good taxes. There are only three good taxes in India. They are the personal income tax, the GST, and the property tax. It is possible to implement these under Indian conditions as long as the rates are kept low with reasonably low distortions. Every other tax in the Indian public finance literature is termed, double quotes, a bad tax. And there is a reason for these things. So there's 100 years of deep public finance knowledge on taxation, and we should not try to reinvent the wheel. So as an example, Rahul correctly said that there are places like Finland where many billionaires have chosen not to leave. And by the way, I would put up France as one of the beautiful countries that if I had to choose where to live, France would be high up there as a great country to live. It's a completely public sector health system that works reasonably well. The law and order is good. The air quality is good, blah, blah, blah. Okay. However, in 2018, the French abolished their wealth tax for these kinds of reasons, that they understood the future of the country depends on that tiny 0.01% of the talent. All the truth, all the beauty, all the wealth is disproportionately made by 0.01% of the world. One Einstein gets 4 papers in 1904. Okay, this is not something about a normal distribution. It is an insanely tiny distribution with a skew with a tiny number of people at the top end. So we should be cautious about these things. I completely do not share the views of either Karl Marx or his 21st century successor, Thomas Piketty.
Right. Professor Menon, since Mr. Shah does not share Mr. Piketty's views, and since you did say that the idea of using the collections that we get from wealth tax and sort of directing it for health and education spending, you seem to be in favor of that idea. It might give us some revenue. The wealth tax might give us some revenue for social sector spending. But when it comes to addressing the issues in allocations in the allocations in the same sectors itself, how do we address that? Or how does this address that?
Right. Okay. Just one point there. The idea of inequality that we are coming at with a wealth tax doesn't even have to be Marxian. It's Keynesian, right? I believe very strongly in what Keynes was saying, that capital. I believe in a certain way that he put it, that capitalism is a system that can give rise to most people's talents. All it requires is that we level the playing field and make it so that everyone can participate in capitalism. Now, I have a lot of problems with capitalism. I have very strong objections to capitalism. That is true. But the point of how we approach this doesn't have to be Marxist. Wealth taxes are not taking over production from individuals. It's just levying a tax. It's a deeply Keynesian idea, and we don't need to bring Marx into this, because I think Piketty calls it participatory socialism, but it's socialism of the social democratic kind, which has been practiced in Europe, which is largely very Keynesian. Now, on the question of, say, allocations and social sector spending, and yes, of course, there are huge problems with social sector spending. We have seen it in education, and all of the Assad and the Pratham surveys that have come out, that there is a huge problem that students are just not up to the mark. And there is a very legitimate question that if we now tax billionaires and we put money over there, there's going to be a problem. Are we just throwing good money after bad? But I do believe that we should talk about the expenditure, the financing question as well, because following Piketty, what I do believe in is that levying a tax and using it for spending allows us to finance a lot of development goals. It allows us a lot of money to finance these development goals, which are broadly needed: health, education, and the fight against climate change. But it also allows us to do this without necessarily running a deficit, right? Without necessarily borrowing from the public. Then we're getting into problems with the interest rates. We're getting into a lot of different problems. The fiscal deficit can be seen as distortionary. What distortion do we choose? If I'm putting it very boldly, how do we do this, right? At taxes, I think the question of how we finance is an important one, because it allows us to spend this money without relying on borrowing from the people. That is a strength of this idea. It might have behavioral effects that would cause a lot of problems, no doubt. We do need to talk about it, but there is something very important about levying taxes to spend that is separate from the question of how do we deal with the problems within the sector. Those have to be dealt with no matter how we do it, whether we borrow to spend on health or whether we tax to spend on health. That question remains. The question of wealth tax is about what do we rely on? Do we rely on taxation or do we rely on borrowing to fund this? And I think what taxation does is that it allows a greater leeway of the state to meet some certain development goals without getting into problems of debt and borrowing.
Right. Mr. Shah, do you see any merit in the idea that it could give us some revenue for these needed crucial sectors? From your point of view, is there any merit in that idea?
No, I think there's zero merit in that idea. There are two separate questions. So if you ask me to put on my hat as an expert on Indian expenditure, then my story will be that the Indian education system works horribly. And we have very, very, very high levels of per pupil expenditure in India, and we are failing. So it is not efficient to put more money into that problem. We have a management crisis. We are failing in how we run these schools. And I have been a Ministry of Finance staff person where we used data like ASER to cogently argue against programs like Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan, which was supposed to become SSA2. And you just keep pouring more and more money because it sounds like a good idea. And no, the way expenditure policy has to be done is to count bang for the buck. And I feel that the wise approach in India is to absolutely choke expenditure until you prove bang for the buck. Okay, innumerable papers have demonstrated that the bad quality private sector schools reproduce the bad quality government sector schools at about 1/3 the price. So the first port of call should be to shut down all the government schools and put up a voucher system. You'd spend 1/3. Okay, this is simple, hard-headed common sense. It is not money. And there is no evidence in India that spending more money on education. So the per pupil expenses in India have grown in real terms for the last 15 years. And the ASER scores have worsened for the last 15 years. There is no evidence in India that pouring more money into education has helped. And similar it is with primary health centers. There is so much academic evidence that nothing happens at an Indian primary center. And so why are we even bothering spending all that? So yeah, you should bring an expenditure hat to the expenditure question. And we should figure out what is an efficient size of the Indian state. I happen to think a meaningful expenditure ratio for India at the present level of development is about half of what is spent today. Most government expenditure is pointless and should not be done, meaning it just doesn't deliver bang for the buck. So first, I would say for about 50 years or 100 years, we have to learn to be a meaningful government where things are done properly, where things are done efficiently. To give money and power to government is like giving whiskey and car keys to teenagers. So first we've got to pull back from the whiskey and the car keys. And then completely separately, assuming you want an Indian state which spends about half of what it spends today, you should ask the question, what's the most efficient way to raise those tax revenues? And the word efficient means, how do you distort the country less? How do you damage civil liberties less? How do you not create a dystopia? How do you create conditions that are conducive to the highly unequal creation of truth, beauty, and wealth that is true of every population in the world? And in my opinion, there is an old public finance orthodoxy that has figured this out. This is not new. This has been around for 100 years, that there are only three good taxes to use in India, which is a personal income tax, GST, and a property tax, and all three using very, very low rates. It is absolutely nuts to have a 35% GST, which is now being proposed for some kind of things. So public finance is a mature, well-known field, and the wealth tax has been analyzed and spit out in that field about 10 times in the last 100 years. And we're just in one more milestone of we will relearn this over and over.
Professor Menon, I'm sure you would have some comments on what Mr. Shah just said.
Yeah, I think again, as would be evident in this whole talk, and this very delightful talk, and I'm having a lot of fun with this, that there are significant differences in how we think about the state. I mean, there is a line of literature that would say that the spending of the Indian state is too less, considering what the developed countries are spending. Look, there is a real problem with how the state is spending, no doubt. There is no way to deny that. I am in education and I see the deep problems with education, that not just at the primary level, but even at the tertiary level. There is a fundamental problem in how we're dealing with education. But I don't think that calls for a complete writing off, right? I think that the state can be, okay, this is going to be sound a little difficult when I say it, that provision of goods through the state for certain important things like health and education is the best possible way to deliver quality outcomes for the populace. I don't think that the provision of goods by a public entity is inherently inefficient. I don't think that the provision of goods by a public entity is inherently problematic. Private universities might have very good outcomes, but they also have very restricted outcomes, right? And this, we can see that I'm talking as someone from a private university, and it is something I see that yes, we have a lot of freedom to do things that I would not be able to do in a state university. I have a lot more resources and it is great, but the composition of my students looks very different from when it was when I studied in a public university. And there is an education in that, in being in a diverse classroom. You get a certain education that you don't just get in the textbooks. It is a challenge, no doubt. How, if we are providing this spending, how do we get the state to provide it well? And I think that the Indian state, even the Indian state, does have the capability to provide things in a proper way. I think, again, we might have a significant debate on this, but I think Narega is an important way to look at what the state has done. I would say, like, the elimination of polio is a success story very few countries have done. India at that time, with those resources to eliminate something like polio in a country of over 1 billion people, shows that the state can be relied upon to provide and to deliver successful outcomes. The question is, how do we do it? Now, that again requires a very significant institutional makeup around the state. We can hold the state accountable. We should hold the state accountable. We should hold the state accountable if it doesn't give goods properly, if it fails on providing civil liberties. I think an unequal economy is just as detrimental to civil liberties as a dystopia. I don't like the term dystopia being used in this context. I think we can have taxation without necessarily falling into a dystopia. But even if we do need to hold the state accountable, but to inherently say from the very beginning that the state's outcomes that are being providing are going to be second best is not very helpful. I think there are examples around the world as well to show when the state wants to provide something properly, it can. Yeah, I'll just leave it at that. I know we're running out of time, but I would just say the idea that the state is inherently second best as a provider is not going to help us in the world we are in today, facing the challenges we are in today. I think the challenge is how do we form the systems necessary to hold the state properly accountable. It's a massive challenge. It's a very difficult challenge. It's a challenge we need to fight for.
Right. So, Mr. Shah, just to tie down this discussion, from the perspective of policy in India, I know you said that growth should be the priority. So, addressing poverty or inequality, what should be from the perspective of policy, what should be the priority in India?
So in my closing comment, I want to say 3 things: that we should focus on growth. And it is far, far better to be a poor person in South Korea than it is to be a poor person in India. So rather than fighting on distribution, we should fight on growth. All measures of well-being, whether you take infant mortality or female empowerment or any measure of well-being that you like, all measures of well-being respond to growth and growth alone. Redistribution never made a country better. Only growth made countries better meaningfully when it comes to well-being measures. So that's my claim 1, that we should not get into this Robin Hood impulse of taking from the rich and giving to the poor. Second, we should decouple the questions of tax revenues and expenditure. Rahul, you cannot imagine how much I share the dream of building a good, competent Indian state. Okay, it's just a dream. I care deeply about it. I've spent my whole life on it. But I also recognize that this stuff is hard and state capability only emerges slowly. So when you look back at the best successful countries of the world, like the UK and Japan, state capability emerged over 100 years, 150 years. Nothing gets done quickly. So if you have a pervasive failure of the Indian police or the Indian judiciary or the Indian education system or the Indian health system, these are 50-year, 100-year journeys to get fixed under good, successful outcomes, meaning you can fail. Okay, so there are countries where for hundreds of years they have tried to emerge as meaningful states and they have failed. So the expenditure side is ridiculously important. I would like nothing more than for the Indian state to emerge to the level of capability where North India has clean air. Okay, every winter we get a report card on the capability of the Indian state. And so far, it's looking horrible. And the state capability literature teaches us that it takes 50 years, 100 years to money materially make a difference. Nothing is going to change quickly. So I have zero interest in adding money to the problem right now. We've got to pull back the money. We've got to get to management. We've got to capability. We've got to get to checks and balances. We've got to create feedback loops. We've got to create forces of accountability so that the Indian state, over a 50, 100-year period, will learn how to genuinely be a state, not an oppressing class, but actually to serve the people, to be an agent of the people. And then third, given that you choose a number for the expenditure GDP ratio, there is a well-defined body of knowledge on what are bad taxes and good taxes. And I'm just a old, boring NIPFP orthodoxy. But there are only 3 good taxes in India. A low-rate personal income tax, a low-rate GST, a low-rate property tax. All other taxes don't work. They induce economic distortions. They damage the project of growth. They create arbitrary power in the hands of tax officers, which will be misused given the lack of constitutional values in the Indian state.
Right. Professor Menon, briefly, please. Poverty or inequality? What should be the priority of public policy in India?
Both. Before I go in, very briefly, I don't think I think one thing needs to be taken off the table, the idea that Dr. Shah is boring. I think that is furthest from the truth, sir. This has been a really fascinating and a fun discussion. I think both. I don't think we should stop only at one, because, I can bring someone above the poverty line, but if they don't have access to health and health and education, and the ability of the government to bring them into that net and equalize opportunities for them is determined by inequality, it becomes harder in an unequal society. So if I'm only going to say poverty, I don't want to just bring people out and leave them there. I think it's important to bring them in to build up capabilities. There is a framework that looks at how the question should not be either or, and that is sense capability approach. It allows us to think that this division between ideas of either poverty or inequality doesn't make sense if you look at it from the focus of capabilities. So I would just leave it like that. It's not an either or. I am not saying growth is wrong. I think we need to aim for a high level of growth, but I would say that it should be both. We cannot leave one by the wayside when talking about the other.
All right, Professor Menon, Mr. Shah, thank you so much. What a fascinating discussion this has been. Thank you so much for joining us at the Parley. I hope you guys enjoyed it. We enjoyed hosting you all. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.